Beloved, hear me by the Spirit of the living God. There is a realm in God that cannot be entered by the intellect, cannot be unlocked by human effort, and cannot be reached by emotional striving. It is entered only by yielding to the Holy Ghost. Many pray with words they understand and wonder why nothing changes. But today I tell you plainly, there is a prayer that bypasses the mind and ignites the spirit. When a man begins to pray in tongues, the first thing that happens is not noise but surrender, because the flesh has always demanded control, and the mind has always insisted on understanding, yet God never asked permission from either to move in power. The flesh is restless, impatient, and proud of its own ability, but the spirit waits for a yielded vessel, not an educated one. Praying in tongues silences the natural man because it removes his greatest weapon, which is reason, and places authority where it belongs, in the Spirit of God dwelling within. When the tongue is yielded, the will follows, and when the will follows, the flesh loses its grip, for the flesh cannot lead where it cannot understand. The carnal nature is always comfortable when it can explain, analyze, and predict. But faith never grows in familiarity. Faith grows in obedience. Tongues force the believer out of self-reliance and into divine dependence. And this is why the flesh resists it so fiercely. The flesh would rather pray beautifully and remain unchanged than groan in the Spirit and be transformed. But the moment a believer persists beyond the discomfort, something holy takes place. For the Spirit of God begins to rise within, not as a visitor, but as Lord. Strength begins to build where weakness once ruled, and the inner man is stirred awake while the outer man grows quiet. When you pray in tongues, you are not speaking from memory or emotion, you are speaking from union. The Spirit prays through you according to the will of God, not according to circumstances, feelings, or fears. This is why tongues are dangerous to the flesh, because they expose its helplessness and strip it of authority. The flesh thrives on control, but tongues demand trust. They train the believer to move without sight, to speak without understanding, and to obey without explanation, which is the very environment where God's power flows freely. The mind, though a wonderful servant, is a terrible master, and tongues put it back in its rightful place. As the mind quiets, the spirit becomes sensitive, and spiritual perception sharpens. Things once confusing begin to settle, not because answers are forced, but because peace takes their place. Burdens lift not through effort but through alignment. Anxiety fades not because circumstances change, but because the inner man is strengthened. The flesh grows tired quickly, but the spirit is renewed as it feeds on divine utterance, and the believer discovers that true rest is found not in silence, but in spirit-led expression. Tongues are not emotional excess. They are spiritual precision. The Spirit knows exactly what to pray, exactly where resistance lies, and exactly what must be addressed in the unseen realm. While the flesh sees no progress, heaven is recording obedience. While the mind hears only sound, God hears faith. This kind of prayer bypasses the natural senses and operates in divine authority, and authority always brings order. Disorder cannot remain where the Spirit is allowed to lead, and confusion cannot survive sustained surrender. As the flesh is silenced, the believer becomes aware of a deeper communion, one that is not rushed or strained. Time loses its pressure, and striving loses its voice. The soul stops demanding results and begins to rest in relationship. This is where power is conceived, not in shouting, not in effort, but in yielding. The more the believer yields, the less the flesh interrupts, and the more clearly the Spirit moves. Faith rises without effort because it is no longer produced by the mind, but infused by the Spirit. Praying in tongues teaches the believer how to live beyond reaction. Instead of responding to fear, the Spirit responds to God. Instead of being driven by emotion, the believer is led by unction. The flesh may protest, grow weary, or feel foolish, but every moment of obedience strengthens the inner man and weakens the dominance of the natural life. What once felt difficult becomes natural, and what once felt unnatural becomes necessary as the Spirit learns to lead and the flesh learns to follow, until the believer discovers that true power is found not in speaking loudly, but in yielding completely, allowing the Spirit to take full expression through a surrendered tongue and an obedient heart that no longer strives to understand before it trusts. When a believer gives 20 minutes to the Spirit in prayer, something far greater than time management takes place, because heaven does not measure impact by duration, but by alignment. Alignment is when the spirit, soul, and body come under the authority of God in proper order, and tongues accelerate this divine arrangement. In the natural, 20 minutes may seem brief, but in the spiritual realm it becomes a doorway, because when the flesh is silenced and the mind is yielded, the spirit is no longer resisted. Divine alignment is not achieved through effort but through surrender, and tongues bring the believer quickly into that surrendered state. Most believers live fragmented lives where faith exists alongside fear, prayer exists alongside doubt, and worship exists alongside worry. Tongues pull these scattered parts into unity, because the Spirit prays from a place of wholeness. As the believer continues, the inner man comes into harmony with God's will, and conflict within begins to dissolve. This is alignment, not emotional excitement, but spiritual order being restored. When alignment comes, peace replaces striving, clarity replaces confusion, and faith replaces anxiety, not because problems disappear, but because the believer is positioned correctly before God. 20 minutes in the Spirit recalibrates the heart. The flesh may resist at first, feeling restless or unproductive, but persistence brings breakthrough. The moment the believer chooses obedience over comfort, the Spirit takes the lead. Thoughts slow, pressures lose their urgency, and the soul stops demanding immediate answers. The Spirit begins to establish God's perspective within, and perspective determines posture. When posture shifts, prayer moves from desperation to authority, and authority flows only from alignment with God's will. Tongues align the believer with heaven's agenda rather than personal desire. Many prayers fail not because they lack sincerity, but because they are prayed from misalignment. The Spirit, however, never prays amiss. In tongues, the believer is carried into agreement with God's purposes, even when they are unknown to the mind. This is why the Spirit intercedes beyond understanding, weaving divine intention into the believer's life, adjusting direction, correcting motives, and strengthening resolve, all without the need for explanation. As alignment deepens, resistance diminishes. Spiritual heaviness lifts because the believer is no longer pushing against God but flowing with Him. The sense of striving fades, replaced by cooperation. This is where 20 minutes becomes powerful, because the believer is no longer scattered but sente. Red. The inner man becomes steady, and instability loses its hold. Faith grows not by mental persuasion but by spiritual positioning, and positioned faith always produces confidence. Divine alignment affects more than prayer. It shapes perception. Decisions become clearer because confusion cannot survive order. Discernment sharpens because the spirit is awake and the flesh is quiet. The believer begins to recognize what is from God and what is from pressure, what is from faith, and what is from fear. This clarity does not come from analysis but from alignment, and tongues are the Spirit's instrument for bringing that alignment quickly and effectively. 20 minutes of Spirit-led prayer also realigns the believer's strength. Many feel exhausted not from activity but from internal resistance. When the flesh is fighting for control, energy is drained. But when the Spirit leads, strength is renewed. The believer rises from prayer not necessarily with answers, but with stability, not necessarily with direction, but with assurance. Assurance is the fruit of alignment, and alignment is the product of surrender. As the believer continues this practice, alignment becomes familiar. The spirit learns to respond quickly to God, and the soul learns to follow without argument. Over time, 20 minutes becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a posture, where life is lived from alignment rather than reaction. The believer no longer waits for crisis to pray, because alignment has become a daily necessity rather than an emergency response. This is why 20 minutes in the Spirit can accomplish what hours of restless prayer cannot. Restless prayer seeks to move God, but aligned prayer allows God to move freely. When alignment is established, heaven and earth cooperate, and the believer becomes a vessel through which God's will flows without obstruction, without strain, and without the interference of the flesh, as the Spirit continues to order the inner life according to divine purpose and eternal intention. When the Holy Ghost prays, he does not pray from information, but from omniscience, and this is the mystery that overwhelms the natural mind. A man praying in tongues is not producing sound by effort, he is yielding his voice to divine intelligence. The Spirit of God searches the deep things of God, things hidden from reason, things inaccessible to emotion, things untouched by human understanding, and he gives utterance according to eternal knowledge. What the believer does not know, cannot see, and cannot articulate is precisely what the Spirit knows perfectly. And this is why tongues are mysteries spoken unto God and not unto men. The natural mind is uncomfortable with mystery because it demands clarity before obedience. But the Spirit operates in the opposite order. He requires obedience first, then revelation follows. When the Spirit prays through a believer, he bypasses the limitations of language and speaks directly from God to God, carrying divine intent without distortion. These mysteries are not vague or random. They are precise, targeted, and purposeful, addressing roots rather than symptoms, causes rather than appearances, eternal matters rather than temporary concerns. The believer may feel unaware of what is being prayed, but heaven is fully aware. Angels respond not to understanding but to authority, and authority flows from the Spirit, not the intellect. While the believer hears syllables, the Spirit is issuing decrees. While the mind struggles to engage, the Spirit is engaging realms unseen. This is prayer that operates beyond time, beyond circumstance, beyond the present moment, reaching into future needs, unseen dangers, divine appointments, and hidden battles long before the believer becomes conscious of them. Mr. E's prayed in tongues often deal with matters the believer would never think to address. Pride hidden beneath humility, fear disguised as wisdom, impatience cloaked in logic, resistance masked as caution. The Spirit exposes and corrects these inward conditions without accusation, without explanation, but with authority. As the believer continues, internal adjustments take place quietly, attitudes shift subtly, and desires realign gradually, not by force, but by divine influence flowing through yielded prayer. The Holy Ghost also prays mysteries that affect others. Intercession in tongues reaches beyond personal needs and touches lives, situations, and regions unknown to the one praying. Burdens are lifted before they are felt, doors are opened before they are knocked on, and protection is released before danger is perceived. The believer may rise from prayer unaware of the impact, but heaven has recorded obedience, and eternity will reveal the fruit of those moments of surrender. Tongues are not about emotional intensity, but spiritual accuracy. The Spirit never wastes words, never prays outside the will of God, and never misses the mark. While human prayer can be distracted, repetitive, or misdirected, Spirit-led prayer is exact. It strikes where resistance lies and releases power where faith alone cannot reach. This is why the enemy resists tongues, because mysteries dismantle strategies that were never exposed to the natural mind. The believer praying in tongues becomes a conduit rather than a commander. Control is relinquished, and cooperation takes its place. The Spirit carries the burden, directs the flow, and determines the content, leaving the believer with the responsibility of yielding and continuing. This posture of trust is itself transformative, teaching the believer to rely not on comprehension but on communion, not on explanation but on obedience. As mysteries are prayed, the inner man is strengthened, Strength does not come from knowing what is happening, but from agreeing with who is leading. The Spirit builds spiritual muscle through repeated yielding, and the believer becomes more sensitive to divine promptings, more responsive to conviction, and more attuned to God's movement. This sensitivity does not produce confusion but clarity, because alignment always sharpens perception. Mysteries also deal with timing. The Spirit prays things into existence before they manifest in the natural. He prepares the believer ahead of events, fortifying faith before trials, and releasing grace before demands arise. This is why those who pray in tongues consistently often find themselves steady in moments that shake others. They have already been strengthened in the unseen, already aligned in advance, already positioned through prayer they did not understand but faithfully yielded to. The Holy Ghost prays mysteries that release healing not only of the body but of the soul and spirit. Wounds buried beneath years of silence are touched without being reopened. Trauma loses its grip without being revisited. Chains fall without noise. The Spirit works deeply and gently, restoring order where chaos once ruled, and life begins to flow where stagnation once remained. As the believer continues in this kind of prayer, dependence on the Spirit increases while reliance on self decreases. Confidence shifts from personal ability to divine partnership. Faith becomes quieter but stronger, less reactive but more assured. The believer learns that the most powerful prayers are often the least understood, and the deepest works of God are often accomplished in silence before heaven, as the Spirit continues to utter mysteries beyond understanding, carrying out the will of God through a yielded vessel who trusts without needing to know. Spiritual strength is never built by accumulation of information but by submission to divine order. And this is why the mind must learn to step aside if the inner man is to rise. The mind was created to serve, not to rule, yet when it dominates, it limits the flow of the Spirit. Tongues restore this order by placing the mind in a posture of rest, while the Spirit takes the lead. This is not the rejection of thought, but the surrender of control, allowing the Spirit to operate without interference from reasoning, doubt, or analysis. The mind constantly seeks understanding before agreement, but faith moves in the opposite direction. Faith agrees first and understands later, if understanding is ever given at all. When the believer prays in tongues, the demand for explanation is silenced, and the Spirit begins to draw strength directly from God. This strength does not come with excitement or outward signs, but with quiet assurance and inner stability. The believer may feel nothing unusual, yet something substantial is being formed within, because spiritual strength is built in stillness, not in stimulation. As the mind steps aside, the inner man becomes sensitive to the movements of the Spirit. Sensitivity is not emotional awareness, but spiritual responsiveness. The believer begins to recognize subtle promptings, gentle convictions, and quiet direction that were previously drowned out by mental noise. The mind, when overly active, creates static that distorts spiritual perception, but when it rests, clarity emerges naturally. This clarity is not forced, it flows from alignment, and alignment strengthens the believer from the inside out. Spiritual strength grows as dependence shifts from mental effort to spiritual yielding. Many believers exhaust themselves trying to think their way into victory, reasoning their way into peace, or analyzing their way into faith. But the inner man is not strengthened by logic, it is strengthened by life, and life flows from the Spirit. Tongues draw nourishment from this life source, feeding the Spirit directly while bypassing the mental struggle that so often drains energy and focus. When the mind steps aside, fear loses its voice. Fear is sustained by imagination and reinforced by overthinking, but it cannot survive sustained spiritual focus. As the believer continues to pray in tongues, anxious thoughts slow, intrusive worries fade, and the weight of mental pressure lifts. This is not because problems disappear, but because the inner man grows stronger than the pressure surrounding it. Strength does not remove resistance, it overcomes it from within. The inner man, once strengthened, begins to govern the outer life. Reactions become measured, responses become thoughtful, and emotions become stable. This is not suppression, but transformation. The believer is no longer driven by impulse, but led by conviction. When the spirit is weak, the flesh dominates. When the spirit is strong, the flesh submits. Tongues consistently strengthen the spirit, tipping the balance of authority away from the natural and toward the spiritual. As strength builds, endurance increases. The believer finds the ability to remain steady in situations that once caused agitation. Waiting becomes easier, obedience becomes lighter, and perseverance becomes natural. This endurance is a fruit of spiritual strength, not willpower. Willpower relies on mental force, but spiritual endurance flows from inner stability established through consistent surrender. The mind stepping aside does not make the believer passive, it makes the believer receptive. Receptivity is where divine instruction is received clearly. The Spirit speaks most effectively to a yielded heart, not a crowded mind. When the noise of reasoning quiets, the voice of God becomes distinct, not louder but clearer. This clarity strengthens confidence because direction is no longer debated internally but received with peace. Over time, this practice reshapes the believer's inner posture. Prayer becomes less about effort and more about flow. The spirit rises quickly into communion, and the mind follows without resistance. The believer becomes accustomed to living from the inside out rather than the outside in. External circumstances lose their power to dictate internal condition, because the inner man has been strengthened beyond dependence on what is seen or felt. Spiritual strength established in this way produces quiet authority. The believer does not strive to prove faith. Faith is evident through stability, consistency, and peace. There is less reaction and more response, less striving and more assurance. This authority is not learned. It is imparted through repeated yielding, through moments when the mind steps aside and the spirit feeds on divine life, growing stronger, steadier, and more capable of carrying the weight of God's purpose without collapse or confusion. Atmospheres are not shifted by volume, but by authority, and authority flows from the Spirit, not from human effort. When a believer prays in tongues, something begins to move in the unseen long before anything changes in the natural. Spiritual resistance thrives where there is confusion, fear, and disorder, but the Spirit brings order simply by being allowed to lead. Tongues introduce the presence and rule of God into places where resistance once operated freely, and resistance cannot coexist with divine authority. Spiritual resistance is often subtle. It does not always appear as open opposition, but as heaviness, delay, distraction, or weariness. Many believers attempt to fight resistance with determination, argument, or emotional intensity, yet these methods rarely produce change. Tongues, however, confront resistance at its source, because the Spirit addresses what the mind cannot see. What feels like mental fog, emotional pressure, or spiritual dryness is often the result of unseen opposition, and Spirit-led prayer pierces through it without struggle. When tongues are released, the atmosphere within the believer begins to change first. Replaces tension, clarity replaces confusion, and confidence replaces uncertainty. This internal shift is the beginning of external change, because atmosphere always flows outward from the inner man. As the believer continues, the spiritual climate surrounding them responds. Opposition weakens, heaviness lifts, and barriers that once felt immovable begin to lose their hold, not because they are confronted directly, but because they are deprived of influence. Tongues do not negotiate with resistance, they override it. The Spirit does not reason with darkness, He dispels it. This is why praying in tongues often feels quiet, yet powerful. There may be no emotional surge, no dramatic sensation, but something steady and authoritative is taking place. The believer may not sense immediate results, but resistance is being dismantled piece by piece in realms unseen, where the real battles are fought. Atmospheres shift when the spirit establishes dominance. Dominance is not aggression, it is presence. When the spirit is allowed full expression, lesser influences retreat naturally. Fear cannot dominate where faith is being built. Confusion cannot remain where divine order is released. Oppression cannot persist where the spirit is free to move. Tongues create space for the spirit to occupy fully, and whatever occupies the space determines the atmosphere. Spiritual resistance often feeds on reaction. It thrives when believers respond emotionally, mentally, or impulsively. Tongues interrupt this cycle by drawing the believer into cooperation with the Spirit, rather than reaction to pressure. Instead of fighting circumstances, the believer aligns with God's authority, and alignment always weakens opposition. Resistance loses leverage when the believer stops engaging it on its terms and begins yielding to the Spirit's leadership. As atmospheres shift, the believer's discernment sharpens. What once felt overwhelming becomes identifiable. The believer begins to recognize when resistance is present and responds not with frustration, but with prayer. Tongues become a weapon not used aggressively but consistently, wearing down opposition through sustained surrender. This consistency builds spiritual momentum, and momentum creates breakthrough, often quietly without announcement. Resistance also loses power when it is exposed to divine light. Tongues release light into dark places of the soul and the surrounding environment. Hidden fears, unspoken doubts, and suppressed pressures are addressed without being dragged into conscious awareness. The Spirit works thoroughly and gently, removing footholds the enemy relied upon. As these footholds are removed, resistance weakens because it no longer has access or influence. Atmospheric change affects relationships, decisions, and direction. Tension eases, conversations shift, and obstacles that once seemed fixed begin to move. This is not coincidence, but consequence. When the Spirit changes the atmosphere, everything within that environment is affected. The believer becomes a carrier of that atmosphere, influencing spaces simply by being aligned with God. Where they go, peace follows, clarity increases, and resistance diminishes. The enemy resists tongues because they operate beyond interception. He cannot interpret them, counter them, or predict them. They originate in divine intelligence and are executed through human obedi. CE. This makes them precise and unstoppable. Resistance thrives on predictability, but Spirit-led prayer introduces divine unpredictability, dismantling strategies before they manifest. As the believer remains faithful in praying in tongues, resistance becomes less intimidating. What once caused hesitation now invites confidence. The believer learns that authority is not something to summon, but something to yield to. Yielding releases power, and power shifts atmospheres effortlessly. Over time, the believer no longer prays to break resistance. They pray from a place where resistance has already been weakened, already disrupted, already losing ground, as the Spirit continues to assert divine order in unseen realms, through a yielded voice and a cooperative heart. Consistency in Spirit-led prayer does not produce repetition. It produces refinement, because every time the believer yields to the Spirit, something unnecessary is removed and something essential is strengthened. Clarity and power are not sudden rewards but gradual results of sustained surrender. When prayer in tongues becomes consistent, the Spirit is trained to recognize the voice of God without strain, and recognition is the foundation of clarity. Confusion thrives where voices compete, but clarity emerges where the Spirit is given regular leadership. Supernatural clarity is not the ability to predict outcomes, but the ability to perceive direction. Many seek answers, but the Spirit produces alignment, and alignment brings clarity without explanation. Through consistent prayer in tongues, the believer becomes attuned to divine timing, divine priorities, and divine restraint. Decisions become simpler, not because options disappear, but because the inner witness becomes strong enough to guide without debate. This clarity does not shout, it settles, and what settles becomes reliable. Power flows naturally. Clarity. When the believer knows where to stand, authority is expressed without effort. Inconsistency weakens power because it fragments focus, but consistency concentrates spiritual energy. Tongues prayed sporadically may bring relief, but tongues prayed consistently build capacity. Capacity determines how much of God's power can flow through a life without distortion or collapse. The Spirit increases capacity gradually, strengthening the inner structure so that power can be carried responsibly. Consistent Spirit-led prayer trains the believer to respond rather than react. Reaction is driven by circumstance. Response is guided by clarity. As clarity grows, emotional turbulence loses its influence. Fear becomes recognizable rather than overwhelming. Distraction becomes noticeable rather than controlling, and pressure becomes external rather than internal. This internal stability is a form of power, because what does not control you cannot direct you. Supernatural power is often misunderstood as dramatic expression, but true power is measured by effectiveness. The Spirit empowers the believer to act at the right moment, speak with precision, and remain silent when necessary. This discernment is the fruit of consistent prayer, not spiritual impulse. Tongues keep the believer connected to divine intelligence, and intelligence applied with obedience produces power that is accurate rather than excessive. Clarity also exposes false urgency. Many mistakes are made not from rebellion but from haste. The Spirit removes haste by establishing confidence. When the believer prays consistently in tongues, urgency is replaced by readiness. Readiness allows the believer to move quickly when God speaks without moving prematurely. This balance is a mark of maturity, and maturity multiplies power because it reduces waste. As clarity increases, spiritual vision sharpens. The believer begins to see beyond immediate circumstances and recognize underlying patterns, spiritual seasons, and divine setups. This vision is not mystical imagination but spiritual awareness shaped by alignment. The Spirit reveals what matters and filters out what does not. Energy is no longer scattered across unnecessary battles, but directed toward assignments that carry eternal weight. Power also manifests as endurance. Many can begin with enthusiasm, but few continue with faithfulness. Consistent prayer in tongues builds spiritual stamina, allowing the believer to remain steady when progress appears slow. This endurance protects power from being spent impulsively. Power preserved through endurance becomes authority, and authority grows through time spent yielding rather than striving. Clarity affects communication. Words spoken carry weight because they are shaped by the Spirit rather than emotion. Silence becomes intentional rather than passive. Presence becomes influential rather than unnoticed. The believer does not need to assert authority because authority is recognized through spiritual posture. This posture is formed in consistent prayer, where the Spirit adjusts tone, motive, and intent long before public expression occurs. Consistent Spirit-led prayer also purifies desire. Power without purity leads to misuse, but the Spirit refines the heart through repeated yielding. Ambition is replaced by obedience, and self-interest gives way to divine purpose. As motives are purified, power flows safely. The Spirit entrusts more to those who are consistently aligned, because alignment safeguards power from corruption. Clarity and power together create confidence, not self-confidence but God-confidence. The believer no longer doubts the source of direction, because it has been tested through consistency. Faith comes quiet but firm, less reactive but more resolute. This confidence does not waver with circumstances because it is anchored in relationship, not results. Over time, consistent prayer in tongues reshapes the believer's spiritual identity. They no longer see prayer as an activity, but as a place of operation. Life is approached from communion rather than crisis. Power is released through obedience rather than effort. Clarity governs movement, and movement expresses authority, as the Spirit continues to lead with precision, strengthening discernment, deepening alignment, and releasing supernatural power through a life that has learned to yield consistently to divine leadership without interruption or hesitation.